Imagine for a moment that today is your last day on earth. You depart with peace in your heart because you've lived a life of intention and purpose. Your wealth is secure. Your loved ones are cared for. And most importantly, your legacy will flourish for generations to come. Most people postpone the conversation about estate planning or believe it's only necessary for the wealthy. However, estate planning, or as I prefer to call it, legacy planning, is essential for everyone, regardless of financial status or age. In this episode of the Wealth Movement podcast, I have the privilege of sitting with Hanna Yang, an estate attorney with nearly 2 decades of experience. We explore various topics from the critical importance of an estate planning to the consequences of neglecting it, and discuss the intricate process of transferring wealth. We also examine how federal laws shape estate plans and touch on the new Corporate Transparency Act and its implications for business owners. I passionately believe that everyone can live a wealthy and fulfilling life. For nearly 2 decades, I've dedicated myself to helping individuals realize this and their potential in their life. If you have any financial questions or wonder if you're on the right path to achieving a wealthy and fulfilling life, feel free to message me at chris@evokewm.com. To learn more about me and my team at Evoke Wealth Management, visit us at evokewm.com. I hope you find value in this enlightening conversation about the vital need for a well-crafted estate plan to protect you, your assets, and ensure the well-being of those you love. If you find this episode insightful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for the latest financial news and wealth updates, and share it with those loved ones who you believe will benefit from it. Thank you for your support, and enjoy this episode with estate attorney Hanna Yang as we delve into the fascinating world of legacy planning.
One misconception about estate planning is that it equates to assets. You are protecting your assets in a sense that you're avoiding probate, and that's a way.
All right, Hanna, thank you so much for joining me on the Wealth Movement. I appreciate you being on today.
Thanks so much, Chris. I'm so glad to be here as well.
Yes, and in spirits of, well, today is Valentine's Day, so first, happy Valentine's Day to you and your
It's you.
husband and your family.
You as well, and your wife.
Thank you, thank you. And so before we get into what you do, and I'm really excited about this particular episode. I think when it comes to your expertise with estate planning and just really estate planning in general, it's something that a lot of people, if you kind of agree with me, don't really think about until maybe something tragic happens or just some type of life change happens. That's been my experience, at least. So I typically always like to bring that topic to mind a lot sooner than later, which is what most people end up doing. So really excited to dive into that. But before we dive into it, I always like to kind of start with some icebreaker questions. And so my question for you, Hanna, is if you could be in any type of movie, whether it's a horror movie, an action movie, a thriller, what type of movie would you like to star in, and why?
Oh my goodness. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that question. Goodness. I probably want to be in some type of like historical fiction type of movie, only because
Ah,
I like things that are based in reality. I know I'm probably offending some Star Wars fans out there, so
yeah, you or
um,
me.
yeah. So probably some type of historical fiction. A personal favorite of mine is Sound of Music. Some people roll their eyes. They're not so much into musicals, but I just love the drama about, World War II
Mm.
backdrop and the family trying to escape and keep the family together. So probably something along those lines.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. I kind of enjoy those honestly as well too, as much as I love Star Wars and fantasy. I think just being able to just, like you said, kind of look back into history and see how things originated and eventually made their way to whatever it is today, I find that quite fascinating. So I like reading those types of books as well, like biographies, and
Hmm.
seeing kind of how people started their lives, most from nothing and really built something.
Yeah, I love, yeah, same as well. Biographies are a favorite of mine as well.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, speaking of biography, do you mind, Hannah, sharing a bit about yourself and also what you do in your practice and how you help people?
Yeah. So I got my start in law as a JAG. So basically as a judge advocate. So I'm an Air Force lawyer. And that's something I've been doing for the past 18 years. First half full time and then the last half as a reservist. And that's actually where I got my start in estate planning, because as you can imagine, military members are constantly going through life transitions. They're constantly deploying, moving, they're separating, they're retiring. So it's actually a very normal part of life in the military. And a lot of people think of JAGs as, Tom Cruise, right? A Be Good Men kind of in the courtroom. And that's some of what we do, but a lot of what we do also involves taking care of the military members and their families and, making sure that they have that mindset of readiness for anything that
Mm.
life can throw their way. So that's where I got a lot of my practice. And then recently, when my husband and I decided to put roots down where we are originally from, which is California, Southern California, I decided I wanted to get into an area of law that was non-adversarial, not necessarily in the courtroom, but really
Mhm.
coming alongside the client, getting to know them, getting to know their family, and really helping them plan for life's uncertainty. So that's a little bit about me and how I got into estate planning.
Oh, that's great. If I may ask, was there anything that kind of prompted you to wanna move into this, specific space of law? I always like, again, going back to origin story, just curious if there
Yeah.
was anything that really kind of pushed you in this direction.
I think it's just the idea of planning and
Yeah.
also just coming from an immigrant background too. There isn't a lot of planning sometimes, and
Mm.
so I think that's something that always that kind of we live with a lot of adventure in our lives, but then there's we want to kind of you know there's only so much we can do, obviously, right? That's in our control, but what we can control, we want to, right? So I think that resonated with me. Also, coming back to Southern California after being away for about 25 years, I thought it would be really helpful to. I was really excited as one of my niche areas to be able to help immigrant families who have, accumulated wealth and kind of gotten past like that emergency stage of life and they
Yeah.
kind of survive and now they need to transfer that wealth to their children. So, coming back to Southern California, it's really interesting to see how people have grown and changed. And I wanted to be part of helping that
Yeah.
transfer.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. Are you, what would you call first generation born here? Like your parents immigrated here or
I'm a little bit of a hybrid. So I was born in not Southern, South Korea, and came as a baby.
oh,
And
okay.
we're not a classic immigrant story. We're kind of a late bloomer immigrant story. So we should have gone back, but
Mm.
with my dad's company. But anyway, all that to say, the immigrant life is, like I said, there's a lot of unexpected twists and turns. And
Yeah.
so, and everyone knows, right? That's life and, life happens. But I think there's definitely things we can do. There are things we can still do within our control, within those parameters to try to take care of our loved ones. And so I think, I felt those. Yeah, those are things that, I just experienced early on. And it's exciting to see how people have grown and kind of come out of that stage, in the immigrant communities. But, we're always going through changes too, right?
Yeah.
Whether you're an immigrant or not, you're always going through changes. And so we want to, as much as we can, plan for things. So,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think you just hit it right there as far as we are always gonna go through changes. And personally, I think it's, accepting that and also understanding that we have full control of whatever change happens in our life that, that we can't control, right? I'm a firm believer things we can and things we can't control. And so one of those obviously is having kids, right? And having a family. And this is something that I tend to get asked a lot, with my background as a financial planner. And this is why, again, having this conversation with you, I think is so important, especially when it comes to estate planning. I think a lot of young families with kids really don't think, I need to worry about, getting an estate plan or getting a trust in place. I'm still so young. That's some things I have to worry about when I'm older, when I'm kind of retired, right? Can you shed some light on that, like your experience and also, especially for young families, what you typically see and probably would recommend, for families like that?
yeah, I think if you have young children, it's very, very critical that you have an estate plan. And a lot of times people think about estate plans as things that you get done after you have all your affairs in order, like after you have a
Hmm.
certain amount of wealth and you feel comfortable sharing that information with another person. Um, but estate planning is more than just your money, right? It's about taking care of your loved ones. And I don't think people realize that if you don't work on your estate plan, that's going to become something that the people that you leave behind will have to then, after the fact, put together for you and figure out. And so for young children, it's not it money is one aspect of it. But there are some other key decisions that if you have it written down and they have the force of the law, that's so much better than having to place that on someone else.
Yeah.
So for example, if you have a minor child, you want to think about who's going to be their guardian if both you and your spouse, or you could be a single parent, right? Unexpectedly pass. Sometimes parents might not be in a marriage relationship. So you might want to think about there's different intricacies there, right? So you
Mhm.
want to think about guardianship. And there's so much more you can do if you have an estate plan where the court is not going to have to get involved, take over your assets, figure out who will dole those assets out to your child. Um, you can decide if you want an age greater than 18 at which your child should inherit, which, by the way, is a very good idea.
Yeah.
And you can decide, if you want different stages of distributions at different ages. You can decide if you want that money to pass outright to them or maybe in a trust so that it's more protected from divorce or creditors or lawsuits. So there's different things you could do that could really set your children, your minor children up to deal with, a harsh, unexpected reality
Mhm.
if you take the time to do it. So it's very critical, especially for people with minor children.
Yeah, I mean, just piggybacking on that, right? I think again, with being so young, right? You're not thinking, "Oh, something's gonna happen to me. I should be here by the time my children are adults," but obviously that doesn't happen all the time. So, what's the common, I guess, process? I mean, say someone doesn't have an estate plan in place and they have young kids, still 5, 6, and husband and wife, they get in a fatal crash and the kids are left alone. I mean, is it the courts will just automatically say, "Okay, now the children go to the grandparents, like, by default?" Or is there a specific kind of process that the courts go through? Because I think that's important. Because I think most people will think, "Oh, well, my parents will take care of them," if they have a great relationship.
Right. It could be the parents, but again, now the courts will have to get involved. And initially, if there aren't any documents in place, they might have to be held in custody by law enforcement. So it could be a pretty horrific ordeal for kids to go through that aftermath of not knowing where their parents are. They're
Mhm.
not even allowed to stay with, a close family friend or next of kin. It just depends. They could be with babysitters. The babysitter might not know what to do with them. So, we're talking about, hours or days. That could be pretty traumatizing for the children. That has nothing to do with money. This is just where do the kids go, right? In the
Yeah.
initial aftermath. So those are some, those are things you want to think about to plan for. But then there's also the money aspect of, yeah, if you have a home and that home is not in a trust, that's going to go through probate. That's rightfully your children's, even if you don't have a living trust or estate plan. But because they're minors, that will have to be administered by the court. That home's going to have to go through a probate process. Any assets that you have, let's say you have accumulated quite amount of wealth, that could really take care of your children, for the rest of their lifetime. But if you haven't appointed anyone to act as a trustee or, executor to administer or hold that, those assets for your children until they're a certain age. Now the courts have to get involved, and that's most of the times. If people have loved people, trusted people in their lives, they would rather entrust their assets and their children. They don't want the courts to get involved with that.
Yeah.
They don't the public, expensive, lengthy process where now you are kind of inviting. Um, Bad actors, right? People out there who are looking for whatever they can. So to get involved and say, that, I don't know, file a false claim. You're just really opening up your personal affairs to the public at that point. And your
Mhm.
children are going to have to live through that as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, personally, I haven't had to go through anything like that, but I'm sure in your line of work, you've seen so many different scenarios, and I'm sure you have a bunch of horror stories that, you can share, for another episode. But it just seems like, again, those are things that we don't hear as often. Those horror stories. It's more so, oh, that can't happen to me. Um, situation, and this is why I bring up estate planning because, we know those things happen. And I feel that, like you're saying, with having proper documents, a will, a trust, that's just one way of ensuring, right? Like you said, that your wishes will carry through when you pass away. Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think a lot of times people think, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but um, in the United States, having a document with your wishes and your signature, right, authenticated by witnesses, that's a big deal. And that has the legal force it
Hmm.
needs. Not having that could mean a lot of things. On the flip side, you're talking about I've seen people wait and wait and wait. And they didn't get simple powers of attorneys that they needed. And now their relatives are having to deal with money that's stuck in accounts, healthcare facilities that they can't actually provide the help that they need.
Hmm.
People having to go through something like a probate process, but on the guardianship side of getting a conservatorship or a guardianship. Um, and so basically, people by putting off estate planning, you're now you're going to make it 100 times worse for the people that you love that you are leaving
Yeah.
behind to pick up the pieces for you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so just kind of getting into that then, right? I mean, is there any I know it's always case by case, but in your mind, is there any indication when someone should go and see an estate attorney like yourself and say, I have a house or I just have, a retirement account. I don't own a house. Do I still need an estate plan, Hannah? Say, for example, someone that's single, right? Maybe they're 30, 45 years old, no children,
Mhm.
um, but they're working, they have money that they've saved. Maybe they don't even own a home. Maybe they're just renting.
Mhm.
Like what scenarios I guess would be uh not ideal, but a situation where it's time for them to really start to consider sooner rather than later.
Yeah. So if you're single, let's say you're talking about a single person with, no
Mhm,
spouse, no kids. So for someone like that, I think the threshold for probate in California is $184,500. And so any amount of assets that you have below that threshold, there are simplified procedures through which, your heirs, let's say you don't have an estate plan, a single person, their heirs would be their parents if the parents are living. If the parents aren't living, it would be their siblings. So there's some process for them to go and kind of hunt things down and um, kind of get those assets. Um, but so that is the threshold for a single person. Now estate planning doesn't necessarily mean you need to have a living a living trust or a will.
mhm,
Um, it could even just be as simple as updating your beneficiary designation. So your IRAs, your life insurance policies, making sure it doesn't just get stuck there, but
mhm,
making sure it passes off to somebody. But for a single person, it really, I think it's yeah, if you own at least a home, usually in California, the average home price lately is about $700,000. That's well above the probate threshold. Um, if you don't want that to pass to your parents, or you don't want your parents to have to go through probate, or your loved ones to go through probate, spend a couple $1,000s, get a living trust done. You're going to be saving your family tens, maybe even hundreds of thousands of dollars that would go to strangers that the court appoints, an
mhm,
attorney, an administrator to deal with um, distributing your assets. So it's just putting a plan together in place, and I think it would really be beneficial, especially for single people, to meet with an estate planner because maybe they actually don't want everything to pass on to their parents or their siblings. Maybe they actually have a significant other, or maybe they have, a very important cause that's near and dear to their heart that they would want their assets to pass to. But I think unless you sit down with an estate planner and kind of go through all your assets one by one so that they can advise them of what documents are necessary,
mhm.
they're not going to know. But at a minimum, everyone, every adult should have a medical power of attorney and then a financial power of attorney. You've got to have those things because um, most of us, we just think of life and death. We don't think of the in between period of incapacity, which could happen
Yeah,
to any of us before we die, right? And
yeah,
just because you're single or young doesn't mean you're exempt from that potential. So at least having those things in place and maybe updating your beneficiary designations if your assets warrant, something a little bit more like a living trust and or a will. Um, that's a conversation I think, I'm open to having with, and I know any estate planner would be with single people. And with people getting married later and later these days, I think, I don't think, the stereotypical single person, right?
mhm.
Who's like, oh, they don't own very much. I think a lot of single people own quite a lot these days. They might actually own a lot more than married couples with children.
Yeah, yeah, I
So
mean, that's
no.
true. Now, what about, you bring up an important part, with real estate, right? A lot of and this is just kind of things I encountered, right? A lot of speaking with, immigrant families, um, they have property, let's just say, and they're like, "Well, I don't need a trust. Can't I just give my property to my children? Just put them on the title of the home, and that way, if I die, they'll get the property." So, problem solved, right?
Right. I've run into that issue quite a lot, especially with immigrant families. And I know sometimes with
Yeah,
financing, so it made sense at the time. And um, a couple things. So if sometimes I've seen parents do that because, they think they're going to let me live there. It's going to become theirs anyways. They take
right.
their name completely off the title and put their children on the
Mhm,
title. So there are gift tax consequences with that. You're also not getting step up in basis later on. But the scarier thing is that now you have absolutely no legal right or claim to that home. And so you are really putting it in the hands of your child. And then if your child gets married and that spouse is not really, happy with whatever arrangement um, was in place earlier, you as a parent have no legal right to that home. So I've seen situations where, there was this kind of good faith understanding. I took care of you, right? As a
Yeah.
hardworking immigrant, you're going to take care of me in my old age.
Yeah.
Here's the house, you know, but, and then things go south. So that's really not a good way to pass on wealth. That's, you are really neglecting yourself and your legal rights. There's
Yeah.
smarter ways to do that and making sure it gets transferred. I've also seen situations where parents are entitled with their children. And if everything goes as planned again, let's say parent dies, and they owned it as joint tenants, and the child takes over, that's fine. But when both parent and child are on title, and let's say one of them gets into a car accident, um,
Mhm.
the other person, you know, they're they're now susceptible to, the lawsuit judgment, right? That
Mm.
could come against the whole. So there's just different things that I think we kind of hodgepodge kind of put together in immigrant situations, um, but there are other ways that wealth can be transferred that where we can ensure everyone's rights and interests are taken care of, and we could even minimize capital gains taxes too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, can you, not to get into too much of the weeds on that, but can you elaborate on that? That's one of the things that, when speaking with a lot of clients, one of the objectives is to keep money in your pockets and not pay
Mhm.
extra taxes, sorry, to Uncle Sam. Can you talk
Mhm.
about that a little bit? You mentioned losing step up in basis earlier and then capital gains in those
Mhm.
situations.
Yeah. So, like, if you passed on, let's say you bought a property for like $500,000, on the date of your death, it's $1 million. You passed it through inheritance through a living trust. Your child can, inherit that property at a step up in basis of $1 million. So, let's say the child decides to sell it shortly after you die. They're not going to have to pay that 15% capital gains tax on that $500 gain. And so that's a huge benefit of passing on property through a living trust.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. And so going backwards, if they didn't do that through a trust and they just put their children on the deed and then took themselves off, right? In that scenario, right, the parents pass away, the children wouldn't have a step up in basis, right?
yeah, just
They would
depending on how
inherit.
they held title. Yeah, depending on like if
Yeah.
the parents are giving them the entire title or they put them on the title, depending on the
Hmm.
timing, you're not getting that full step up in basis. You might get a partial one, right? Or you might,
Yeah.
yes. So those are all things that you want to think about with your financial planner, and then come to us, or to an estate planning firm to come up with the best way to pass on wealth while minimizing capital gains tax.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a huge one that, again, a lot of, again, especially I think immigrant families really don't understand as much. So that's why I'm glad, we're talking about this because that just seems to be the very common theme when I'm working with a lot of them is that let me just put my children on the deed and I don't need to worry about probate
Mhm.
or worrying about a trust or, different situations.
Right.
But clearly, obviously, there's advantages and disadvantages, especially of doing something like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, just kind of talking a little bit about that, I work with a lot of widows and widowers, and we kind of had a brief conversation about this kind of on our pre-call. Um, when people already have a trust, let's just say, and their spouse passes away, not really much else has changed besides the loss of one's spouse. So oftentimes the surviving spouse doesn't feel like they need to review or make any changes, right, to the trust. But you brought up something very important, and could you share on that as far as why it's still good to review the trust and that there's still potentially some changes that you might want to consider after losing a spouse?
Yeah, absolutely. So, if the spouse has already had a trust, they're for the most part, there are many different types of trust, but for the most part, you've got your simplest form, which is an A trust, where one trust stays as one trust,
Hmm.
or they might be coming back again, but haven't been as popular recently. But you've got what's known as an AB trust, so a single trust that splits up into two trusts, one for the surviving spouse and for the spouse that passed away. The trust for the spouse that passed away becomes irrevocable, whereas the trust for the spouse that survived um, continues to remain irrevocable and something that the survivor can change. So um, that's something that, based on life circumstances, the surviving spouse might actually have some, reasons why they need to get that amended. And that's something that they can fully amend. Sometimes I run into widows or widowers who aren't aware of that, or they just haven't thought of it, And so sometimes their preferences might have been different when they were with their spouse, um, with their former spouse, and life has changed and they want to make some amendments. So
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm sure, like in your experience, I mean, have you come across a lot of people after the fact making, some adjustments, after letting them know that, hey, it might be worth considering?
absolutely, yeah, and absolutely, and even if there aren't any changes to be made, it's really important for them to sit down and get, get their estate plan reviewed. Many of them also don't understand that the assets that are in the trust of the deceased spouse are not going to get a second step up in basis when the surviving spouse dies. So they need a plan for that. They need a plan for
Mm,
that for beneficiaries.
hmm.
That's a usually there's a pause there with in our conversation when they realize how much taxes their children might have to deal with. So that might warrant another conversation, for other tax mitigation strategies with their financial planner or estate planner. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I think that's again just important to highlight, right? A lot of people don't realize that, and especially if the surviving spouse has lived, so many years past their deceased spouse. I mean, that deceased spouse estate could just continue to appreciate, vastly. And like you said, once the
vastly yes.
children inherit it, the amount of tax implications can be huge that maybe the children are not even ready for.
Right. Right. Yeah. So I've seen it. Yeah. So I've seen it both ways where people are surprised about what they can do with the, surviving spouse's trust. And they're also surprised about what the consequences of the deceased spouse's trust will be. So those are both realities they need to, sit down and at least every couple of years review with an estate planner to make sure that they're still on track with their overall goals.
Now, I have a quick curious question. In your experience, right, working with families, do you often see, say the husband and wife, right, the patriarch, the one that has built the wealth? Do you often see them bringing their children in to the conversation when maybe they're creating the trust or reviewing it with you? For me, it's important that they do that, but I know a lot of families don't, and I'm just curious what your experience has been,
Mhm.
especially when it comes to generational wealth, right? And protecting that wealth for the family.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of times they do bring their children in. In fact, a lot of them want their children to be, to serve as the trustees.
Hmm.
Pretty common to see them wanting to appoint, pretty much all the children kind of in a particular order. Um, so I think, yeah, especially with immigrant families too, they're kind of wanting that, that bridge there. So, and they heavily rely on their children to kind of be that bridge in making legal and financial decisions. And they've kind of had that. So I do want to be careful about undue influence. So I do, try to keep that in mind and I let them know it's their decision.
Yeah.
Really, right. But, so for the most part, when families are distributing their wealth in a pretty equitable manner, it's pretty
Hmm.
frank and open. I would say sometimes where they haven't brought their child in, it might be more there's a very altruistic purpose of not wanting to corrupt the child and, letting them know how much is in the pot
Right.
for them later on. It's to
Right.
kind of make sure that they kind of grow up with the initiative they need. Um, I think those are kind of the situations where where they have some concerns about, again, immaturity, and maybe they're just not at that point yet. Um,
Hmm.
for the most part, I think parents do, for the most part, want to bring their children in on the conversation and kind of get that understanding for them so that there aren't big surprises later on.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's interesting, that you mentioned that, just obviously as a side combo with a fear of the children knowing, right, how much they're potentially going to inherit. And
Yeah.
maybe their fear is, oh, my child will just become lazy all of a sudden or just start asking for handouts, right? Because they know how
Right.
much we have. And that's a very real, I think, concern, right, for a lot of parents when wanting to talk about their wealth. I don't know if you've ever had any experience with that, but has there been any situations like that? And how did you? I don't know if you did or brought someone else, but how did you help kind of overcome maybe that fear that that person had, and then eventually brought in their children to start talking about kind of their estate?
Yeah, I don't think it's a matter of like completely shutting the children out, but it's a matter
Yeah,
of when they will bring that in. And so it's making sure that they have, appointed a trustee that can bring the child in on that conversation at a certain point.
yeah.
Maybe building in a higher age at which the child will inherit, or at different stages.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I do, present a lot of options and really kind of put the ball in their court based on, the dynamic they have with their child. But, I think getting as many trusted people on board, to be part of that team, I think, whether it's relatives or friends, to be part of that is really helpful. But yeah, for
Yeah,
the most part, I want there to be that transparency and that openness, no big surprises.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important to have that transparency again to whatever degree maybe the parents are comfortable with, just that transparency with their children, especially if they're adult children, um, kind of going through a little bit of the finances and what the wealth looks like. Because in my experience, working with a lot of children who inherit massive amounts of wealth, sometimes if there has not been that transparency or even those conversations, and all of a sudden they've come into, a large inheritance, I've seen sometimes where they just freeze up and not too sure what to do because again, they weren't expecting so much from their
Mm,
parents. And
mm.
oftentimes they don't want to make the wrong decisions and, whatever it may be. So I just wanted to get your take on that
Yeah.
because being in your role.
Yeah, I think that's where there's a lot of overlap with the financial planner, and especially having
Hmm.
someone that, and I know there's like financial planners out there who work, multi-generational, right? They work
Yeah.
with the parents, their children, and their children. And so having that trust and that continuity is really key. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but I do try to encourage as much transparency, as possible for everybody. And just I know it's more of a matter of when they'll let their children know, right? Of
Hmm.
plan for them, and not so much a matter of if, but of when. So
Exactly. Exactly. I think that's so important for the parents to just keep in mind. Just a matter of yeah, when.
yeah.
And so I think another thing I wanted to just kind of briefly discuss, right? People that have a lot of properties, say, or things like that nature, um, protection, asset protection, having everything in trust. Are they protected? I think that's a common thought
Mhm.
process, right?
Right.
Protected from litigation, protected from lawsuits. How does one protect themselves if they've amassed so much wealth from situations like that?
Yeah, and I think yeah, one misconception about estate planning is that it equates to asset protection.
Hmm.
You are protecting your assets in a sense that you're avoiding probate, and that's a way of maximizing, how far your assets will go and keeping it away from probate fees, right? So yes, you are maximizing the reach of your assets, but you're not necessarily building in, another layer really against creditors or lawsuits or yeah. Um, the effects of litigation. So, Asset protection is something that our firm provides and other estate planning firms provide as well, but that's an additional step. Um,
Hmm.
you have your estate plan with the foundational documents, your living trust, your will, your powers of attorney. But typically, if you have properties, there are other things that you could do to, let's say, there are no guarantees, right, in the legal world, but
Hmm.
speed bumps, right, that you can put in place. Um, Things that you can do to incentivize, let's say, if you are in some type of litigation, incentivize the other party to, let's say, offer settlement rather than take you to court.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, would you say that'd be important, especially for people that have investment properties and rental properties with renters?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially, so even just something as simple as putting your property into an LLC,
Hmm.
then having that LLC assigned into your trust. Everything flows into your trust so that you are avoiding probate. But on the flip side, you're also kind of mitigating um, any effects of the litigation that unfold from, a particular property. You're, kind of insulating those effects um, within that LLC and preventing those effects from kind of affecting the rest of your assets. Um, so it's kind of like a little bomb going off, right? And you're kind of
Yeah.
making sure the bomb goes off within the LLC and not outside of the LLC. So that's kind of one way of thinking about it. And a lot of times people ask, well, what about umbrella insurance?
Right.
Isn't
Yeah.
isn't that a great way? Like I think of it as LLCs as more of like on the offensive, and then umbrella as the defensive. Umbrella, you're waiting for something to happen, and then sure, you're going to have a payout, against maybe some type of nuclear judgment
Hmm.
in court, but then your premium is going to go up, and
Hmm.
you're not really warding off um, people who are kind of trigger happy and wanting to take you to court. This country is becoming more litigious every day. California is one of the yeah, probably up there. It might have the most lawsuits in the country. So
Really?
I think so. Yeah. So if you have property, and depending on what county you live in and how generous the juries can be in awarding punitive damages, which are usually like, about triple the amount of, whatever damages someone suffers.
Yeah.
You could easily get like, a judgment that's over $1 million.
Wow.
Easily,
Yeah.
for like someone slipping on your property, right? And having a
Yeah.
bad fall. Um, Especially someone, let's say, already was medically fragile and now, let's say, I don't know, paralyzed, right? So,
Hmm.
or partially paralyzed, that's on you. That's on your property if you didn't take certain, precautions. And even if it wasn't you, now you're having to pay out of pocket to pay an attorney, to deal with the fact that, a lawsuit has been filed against you. So having that
Hmm.
LLC, having some type of something on the offense there, that kind of puts personal injury attorneys on notice. Like, okay, there's going to be a little bit more work here, even if we were to win to collect on this judgment, and it might give them some pause, right? So,
Hmm.
um, yeah, so those are things. There are different things that people can do to protect their assets to the fullest. Um, Within their control, right?
Yeah.
To try to keep things as favorable as they can, right? Keeping the decision making space more on the settlement side rather than um, on the lawsuit side.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you put it perfectly as far as it is just merely creating a lot of speed bumps or more speed bumps for the other party to try to have to go through, and doesn't obviously guarantee you from full protection, right? But it's merely in mindset, there's a lot of work that needs to be done because this person has an LLC, say, versus someone that's not protected. Am I correct on that?
Right. That's exactly.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Perfect. Well, we're just kind of finishing up here, Hannah. But there was one thing that I wanted to ask you about. I also work with a lot of business owners, and we briefly touched about this. But I don't think a lot of business owners are aware of this Corporate Transparency Act. But can you share some thoughts on that and why it's so important, especially for business owners to be aware of this?
Yeah, so it's a new federal law that went into effect January 1st of this year. And so this doesn't apply to all business entities. So it doesn't apply to, insurance firms, banks, credit unions,
Hmm.
companies that have 20 or more full-time employees with a physical presence in the US and, have $5 million revenue per year. But for anything else, LLCs, corporations, any type of business entities that were formed in a state, starting in January of this year, there are some filing requirements, and this applies. So let's say you created an LLC in 2024. The requirements for any entities created this year, you have 90 days up until the point of creation to report into a federal database who the beneficial owners are, anyone who has an ownership interest. Um, so let's say you own an LLC 100%. You have to report that for your LLC. If that's in your trust and that's a joint trust with your wife, that might change
Hmm.
how you report who the owners are. Um,
Mm.
if you created a business entity prior to 2024, you actually have a little bit longer than 90 days. You have until January 1st of 2025 to report that information. So there's a little bit more leeway there. But then moving forward, unless somehow this law gets overturned, anytime there's a change in ownership, that change needs to be reported. And the fines for not complying with this are up to $500 daily,
Wow,
and
daily. That's huge.
daily, and imprisonment, and even potentially a felony conviction.
Oh my
So
gosh.
this is so this is a new law that went in effect. Obviously, there's a good purpose behind it, which is to get behind shell companies and money laundering and tracing down terrorism.
Hmm.
But it is having the effect also of um, affecting a lot of small business owners or people who are trying to amass wealth and protect it through LLCs and corporations and things like that. So that's something that any um, business owner, small business owner in the United States should be aware of and needs to comply with to avoid
Yeah.
those penalties.
Yeah, that's huge. And I mean, is it as simple as obviously they can contact you for more information, but is it also as simple as just someone Googling Corporate Transparency Act if they have an LLC and whatever process they need to go through in order to comply?
Yeah, there is a website and there are some detailed FAQs. Our firm
Yeah.
has put together a process so that if you
Okay.
want to deal with the analysis of what qualifies as a beneficial ownership and you just kind of want to take that burden off of yourself, we do have a process for that. But that is definitely something that business owners on their own can file as well. They can look it up and there's FAQs that they can follow and do that.
Okay. That would be great. I mean, if it's all right with you, if I can maybe grab that link from you and I can kind of share it when we post this podcast. That way
Yeah,
people can
absolutely.
visit
I'll
your
send you
site and
that
see
link.
that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Hannah, I know there's obviously a lot more when it comes to estate planning that we can talk about, but is there anything as we're wrapping up, anything that you think maybe we didn't really touch on that comes to mind for you that is important for people to be aware of when it comes to estate planning?
I think because this was on Valentine's Day, I was thinking, don't get your loved one flowers or chocolates. Get your estate plan done. And I think you're going to be doing so much more for your significant
I
one,
love that.
your significant other by doing that than just getting
uh,
them like a dozen presents.
yeah. Imagine that conversation at dinner tonight. Hey, what happens if we die? Let's do it our estate plan now.
But I know. All jokes aside, I think it really is obviously it's a very serious thing to have to deal with. But really, it is a very, very practical and key way of taking care of those that you love, because otherwise you're basically pushing that on to them.
Mhm.
And I don't know, just going through now, I think I'm at the age where I'm at more funerals and weddings.
Oh.
But it's a real,
Mhm.
it's a reality that we're dealing with, right? As we're growing, as we're growing up. You just, you want to start well, but you also really want to finish well, right? We all want to
Yeah,
finish well, right? Yeah. What if you had a great start, but you just fizzle out? I mean, you really want to finish well. So, um,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing too that again, just to highlight on, right, is when people think about estate planning, they think about, oh gosh, what happens when I'm dead? I'm gone, right?
Mhm.
I don't want to think about that. And I always like to think of estate planning as legacy planning.
Yeah,
It's really how can you keep your legacy alive when you're gone? And I think just having that shift in mindset is can be so powerful because like you were talking about with children and being able to help them even if you're gone through the use of trust and having certain provisions in place that can ensure that they're going to be okay financially or at least for the most part be looked after by having the right guardians in place. And people don't even really think about that until situations prompt them to, which is usually a negative situation, I think.
right. Like a near death experience. But I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I think, even if whoever it is, if you can find a trusted financial advisor and an estate planning attorney to like craft together, right? Your
Mhm.
legacy
Mhm.
the type of legacy you actually want to leave behind. I think you really are showing, true love, to
Yeah.
your so.
Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly. And so that is why in Valentine's Day, it is a great gift.
Yes. Yes.
Well, Hannah, before I let you go, how can people connect with you? Obviously, I'm going to get this information and post it, but how can people connect with you? What's the best way to do so?
Mhm.
And also, if they're interested in getting more information, maybe setting, I don't know if you do like free consultation meetings or what does that process look like?
Yeah, so free consultations for sure. About 60 minutes. I'll go longer if
Hmm.
necessary. And they can decide at that point once I've taken a look at their assets, if it
Hmm.
makes sense, to move forward. But yeah, they can contact me by email, hannah@birthattorneys.com, or they can call me on my office line. So either way, yeah. Um, just and if they absolutely don't need an estate plan, they don't need a trust, I will absolutely let them know as well. Like, so
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And I
Um,
think I'm glad you mentioned that too, right? I think a lot of people feel like, oh, maybe she's expensive or just do I really need it? And I
mhm,
think to answer that question is set up the meeting. It's free, it's 60 minutes and finding someone like yourself who's going to be honest and say, you know what? I think you're fine. You don't need my services. I think that's important,
mhm.
for
Yeah,
people to realize.
yeah. Turn plenty of people away to let them know, "Hey, you really don't need this amendment or you're okay
Yeah.
where you're at." So, but yeah, I think it just, if you can get that free review, right? Just of your assets and just to kind of see. And just so that you can understand like when you should come back potentially, right, in the future.
Hmm.
That's something that I'm willing. But I just really like meeting people, kind of seeing where they are and getting to know them and getting to know their life story.
Awesome. And do you do virtual meetings as well, or is it all in
Yes.
person?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. If they wanted to do a Zoom or phone, that's fine as well. So I'm available any of those modes and methods.
Great. Awesome. Well, Hannah, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed the conversation. And I think, again, this will resonate with a lot of people because it's one of those touchy subjects, right? That a lot of
Yeah.
people kind of put in the back of their mind, but it's important to kind of bring that forward. So,
Thanks
so
so much
thank
because
you.
I really enjoyed. Yeah. Thanks. I had a great time and you're a great host. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I know the conversation I'm going to be having with my wife today is about our estate plan. So
Sweet.
thank you for that.
Along with some chocolates, right? And
Yeah,
some.
yeah, exactly. Thanks, Hannah.
All right. Thanks, Chris.
securities offered through Kestra Investment Services, LLC, member FINRA, SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through Kestra Private Wealth Services, LLC. An affiliate of Kestra is Devote Wealth Management, and Kestra Investment Services are not affiliated. Kestra is and Kestra is do not provide tax or legal advice. The opinions expressed in this commentary are those of the author and may not necessarily reflect those held by Kestra Investment Services, LLC, or Kestra Advisory Services, LLC. This is for general information only and is not intended to provide specific investment advice or recommendations for any individual. It is suggested that you consult your financial professional, attorney, or tax advisor with regard to your individual situation. Comments concerning the past performance are not intended to be forward-looking and should not be viewed as an indication of future results.